Hey, it's me again. So, the first video was this long introduction slash rant about why we need to evolve our administrative structures, and basically the point there was we need to do that just to avoid the collapse of our civilization and the potential extinction of our species. And I made the argument that minimizing the risk of war should be our main priority. And the way to do that is to have more a democracy and also better democracy. Because people rarely decide to go to war. I mean, collectively, they don't decide that. It's the leaders who actually want wars, and most often for reasons that conflict with the interests of the people whom they lead. So now I will go into what a reiterated humanity management solution would actually look like. And maybe from the title of this series you can guess that at the center of everything I'm saying is the concept of decentralized autonomous organizations. In the last video I explained the basic mechanism of how these work, but let me briefly go over that again. A DAO is a social and potentially professional structure, all members of which control its administration. And let me use my favorite DAO as an example, which is Dork.tech, a collective of professionals providing software development services to clients, which sounds like how you would describe a company, right? Or an agency, except for one key aspect. There's no CEO. There's actually no hierarchy of any sort. We all pay 10% of what we earn to our internal treasury and then vote on how that gets allocated. Now, the co-op organizational model has been imagined and implemented all throughout history in different forms. I'm from Romania, and this was a communist country before 1989, which had adopted its governance model from Russia. And instead of private enterprise, which wasn't allowed, there were these collectives of professionals, but unfortunately they were missing this key aspect of decentralization. In fact, they were actually part of an utterly totalitarian structure. And before recently, it wasn't apparent how you can organize the economy into worker-owned organizations without the risk of falling into a police state. The critical difference between modern DAOs like Dork.tech and the ones that have been previously attempted throughout history is technology, and specifically a certain type of technology which is referred to as trustless, and it's relatively new. So what this technology enables is knowledge without trust. You can know a certain a piece of information without needing to take anyone's word for it. So just take a second and internalize this. Trust, right now, is at the center. It's essential to our way of life. And I don't mean just personally, although that too, but at a high level, we need to trust our institutions. We need to trust our leaders, and we need to trust our money, our currency. Democracies in particular rely on trust, while authoritarian countries rely on a mix of nationalism and fear. But also, I mean, there's a spectrum. There's no clearly defined line of separation. It's important to notice that as trust in institutions goes down in a country, it becomes a fertile ground for dictatorships of all sorts. So trust is key. One factor that undermines trust is, well, it's commonly called misinformation, but that lately has become somewhat of a loaded term. So let me describe it as a new dimension of elusiveness that truth has acquired through the use of modern information technology. Maybe you've noticed that lately truth is in short supply. I mean, in addition to all the other shortages that we're facing in our supply chains, truth is also quite hard to come by. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for the general average population to pin down facts. We can still agree that the sky is blue, but that's kind of where it ends. From history to molecular biology, everything has a counter narrative. And that's especially true for current affairs like military conflicts and election results even. And it's in our nature to doubt whatever piece of information comes our way. That's by no means a bad thing. It's like a social immune system that has evolved to make sure that we only have the worthy ideas rising up to the top. You know, nature achieves health through balance. And the way this is supposed to work is you have supporters of competing viewpoints, debate, and then the outcome of the debates are, they result in high caliber, truthful facts, strategies. But to stay in this analogy, we now have like an autoimmune disease where this defense mechanism is actually attacking our vital functions. And this is attributed to the ease with which anyone can satisfy their natural tendency to contest ideas. Furthermore, certain centralized interests can exploit this phenomenon using considerable resources in a very organized way, and they can ensure that arguments are kept alive indefinitely and don't reach any outcome. And they do this with the sole purpose of sowing uncertainty. Now, what got us into this position in the first place is a failure to recognize and anticipate certain use cases of our technology. So let's look at what we're developing right now and our emerging capabilities as they pertain to this trust issue. Well, plainly put, we now have, not so plainly, but I don't want to use profanity. So we have natural language neural networks that can produce human-level arguments. Me personally, I can have a few thousand Facebook users, non-human, arguing in favor or against certain things, completely autonomous, and it wouldn't be obvious to anyone that these are not real people. So that's me. But Facebook itself, if it wants to, it can have 500 million of these. And they can hold the line in debates. I mean, not just hold the line, but completely, overwhelm the other side. They can disseminate content of any kind, and they can operate with more intellectual savviness than the average Facebook user. Couple that with the ability to spontaneously generate fake video content, and you might realize that for the average person, locating the truth would be a dubious proposition at best, like they say in Django Unchained. It would be like finding a single piece of cat hair on the streets of Buenos Aires. Quite difficult. Now you might say, okay, but Facebook wouldn't do that, or Reddit, or YouTube, or Twitter. They wouldn't do that. Or the government could not force companies to do stuff like that if they don't want to, not even under martial law. Or you can say, hey, just don't get your news from social media. Get it from, official sources, like the government. Okay. So which government would that be exactly? Because different governments say different things about, certain events. Is everyone in a country supposed to trust their own government? Or is everyone in the world supposed to believe one specific government? I mean, whichever way you slice it, there doesn't seem to be any obvious solution to this trust issue. Which brings us to the reason why we're here today. Trustless technology. It allows us to secure the truth. In a very beautiful way, it mirrors two fundamental principles of the universe. One is relativism, and the other is democracy. Yes, democracy is built into the fabric of our universe. Alan Watts, the philosopher, helped me understand that. And yes, philosophy can also reveal insights into the nature of our universe, not just physics. So let's do a thought exercise to illustrate that. Imagine yourself as an immaterial observer in a universe that only has two particles. Imagine the tips of my fingers as the only two things in existence. And you yourself, you are immaterial, but you can perceive. You are perception itself. So my fingertips are the only two things that exist. And now this happens. Well, looking at this video, what you perceive is this one moving away, right? However, that's just because you have this whole frame of reference, which includes but isn't limited to the tip of my nose, the microphone, the stuff in the background. But if these were indeed the only two things in existence, what you would perceive is this. Both of them moving away from each other at an equal rate. Because there's no such thing as standing still. Because you need to relate stillness to something else that is standing still, and there's nothing else besides these two things. Now let's imagine you have this situation, and there are three, like the vertices of a equilateral triangle. And then the same thing happens, right? Well, you can say this one is moving away, or you can say that these two are moving away, or all of them are moving, but what you know for a fact is that the distance between these two remains constant. So, the more participants you have in this self-referencing stable system, the more you, the impartial immaterial observer, tend to project precedence upon this system rather than upon this solitary particle that is doing its own thing. So this illustrates how it illustrates the inescapable dual nature of our existential paradigm, but also how the closest you can get to absolute truth is just majority-based truth. Trustless technology is acknowledging this state of affairs by having at its core immutable mechanism and transparent mechanism for reaching and for securing majority-based truth. So that means there are no doubts about how it works. Everyone can verify the mechanism, and at the same time nobody can tamper with the process. We tend to regard our institutions, we don't anymore, that's the problem, but these are ideal attributes of state institutions, right? Solid, resilient to any perturbing factors, and auditable. We need to know what's happening there, especially since they're using public funds. But the fact is, institutions are only as trustworthy as the people who operate them, right? So it's not the idea of the court system or the police that is losing trust. No, it's the actual people who make and enforce decisions there. And the lack of trust usually comes from the impression that institutions might be straying away from what the law describes their activity to be. So what trustless technology can do is make sure, it can make breaking the law impossible. I know that's a very audacious claim, but let's continue and see how this actually works. So, and by the way, I'm sure you might be wondering if I'm here advocating socialism, just so that you can either dismiss it or embrace it based on where you stand. And the answer is no. What I'm saying here has not been theorized by any socialists, from Karl Marx to Richard D. Wolff or anyone in between. Although, like I said, there are components of socialism, but the thing that makes all the difference is how trustless technology enables a form of hyper-democracy, Of course, the idea of worker-owned enterprise, yes, that's fundamentally socialist. So we're taking the best of what socialism offers, which is democracy in the workplace, and also the best of what capitalism brings to the table, which is competition in the market. And we are using trustless technology to bind it all together in a framework that is very nimble, in the sense that it's flexible and can upgrade itself orders of magnitude faster than just changing the leaders every 4 years. And also, this governance framework that I'm proposing is AI ready. So it's ready for AI. And what that means is two things. First, as more and more professional categories are automated, the public remains the ultimate beneficiary of the revenue that machines generate. And the other point is that as essential services are automated, like public safety, critical infrastructure, and national security, so terminators, there is no risk of any bad actors exploiting these automations outside of the democratically prescribed purposes. So these bad actors can be either human or cybernetic. And I will also make the argument for why everything that humans do that doesn't involve artistic expression will be completely automated. And this is not something that we can prevent regardless of our policies or social structures. So this is the concept at a high level. It's a territorial administration in which democracy isn't limited to just periodically picking leaders. So the citizens have a much more meaningful part to play in the governance process. And then you have worker-owned enterprise, and then the safe integration of AI. So today I think we'll just discuss the first point, and we can look at it either from the bottom up, seeing how decentralized autonomous organizations interacting with each other result in a more democratic territorial administration, or from the top down, seeing how an administration that is effectively run by the population requires democracy all the way throughout to all the way down to the professional organizations. But when I started this series, I mean, the first point that I made here, which is also the main point, is that we're looking for a solution to minimize or eliminate the risk of civilizational suicide by war. Suicide by war. And I want to make a short tangent here because I use the word suicide. And that usually designates someone who intentionally kills themselves, and perhaps to some it might appear that humanity would not make a conscious decision to destroy itself. If there was a nuclear war, we would unconsciously sort of sleepwalk our way into that, because the escalation ladder is this thing that nobody controls, and it has this terrible inertia, almost like a flywheel. And yes, that is all true. Unfortunately, I don't think we can plead ignorance on this one. I mean, yes, we may not have this unified consciousness that decides to kill itself, but we're definitely mature enough to know better. And if we fail to rise up to the occasion, and if we allow our barbaric nature to get the best of us and fall back into our old ways of waging war while being armed with these world-ending weapons, well, then we obviously don't deserve what the future has to offer in terms of technology, since we can't even responsibly handle nuclear fission. And at the same time, all of the work and the struggles of our ancestors, we kind of render those meaningless. And we also deprive future generations of the chance to fall in love. And it's also like a big FU to nature itself, wouldn't you say? It's like a spit in the face of whatever entity or phenomenon made us the most epistemologically advanced life form. I mean, and even though creation is this like mystery still to us, it's like we're saying to it, hey, you know what? We don't want it. Take it back. Fuck you. Fuck your planetary ecosystem and your precious miracle of life. So this type of nihilism is actually the mutually assured destruction. It's like we're saying, no, we're not losing the war. We're losing any and every war that anyone would ever fight ever. Right? Or, okay, maybe it's acknowledging that yes, we are losing the war. At least there's that much sanity to recognize that you're losing the war. But you're also saying, hey, at least nobody else is winning. I mean, this is profound eroticism. So, yes, in our culture, that's how we view suicide, right? It's very reprehensible. Christianity condemns it. But it's also the law. I mean, society views it as a mental health issue. So at the level of the individual, we're quick to identify it as a problem, but for some reason, when it comes to our entire civilization, we're kind of used to the idea that suicidal tendencies are normal. And, there are degrees to this, like burning carbon into the atmosphere is like, I don't know, smoking like 30, 40 cigarettes a day. So it's unhealthy. But launching nukes is literally like picking up the gun and blowing your brains all the way out. I'm sure that most people would agree that it's not normal and it is a problem. And it's crazy to have this threat at all times. But at the same time, the attitude that I'm seeing from most people is like, yeah, it's sad, but what can you do? This is how the world works. And I'm also asking, what can you do? But I'm not asking it in this sort of rhetorical, helpless kind of way. I'm actually looking for answers. So the main filter through which I am contemplating any alternate system of governance is to minimize this self-destructive tendency. Because if we do that, if we can work out our issues that we have with each other, we're taking over this entire universe. Okay? It's us. It's the humans, baby. Game, set, match. We have no enemies outside ourselves. And what's even crazier is if we don't even have issues with ourselves at the level of the general public. Like I said in the last video, it's our leaders who are incentivized to start wars. And if the decision is left to the people, then they are much more likely to choose peace because the collective intelligence can come up with many plans and strategies that are preferable to war. So let's take the top-down approach and describe how we can make our most important decisions based on common sense rather than on narrow interests. So, why is our democratic power just limited to picking leaders once every few years? Do you know? 2 reasons. Elections are complicated and they are resource intensive. They take lots of time and money to put together, and there's also a considerable effort on the part of the voters. So this is one. The other one is that it's continuity, right? So you can't be changing people in charge too often because nothing gets done, because they just cancel each other's policies. But I would argue that this is a consequence of the first reason, because if you could have elections more often, let's say it was somehow feasible, you wouldn't just keep voting people in and out of office, right? That's not what the vote would be about. You would vote on the actual decisions, like what projects to fund, what wars not to start, and so forth. The only reason why we need someone trustworthy is because it's not feasible for all of us to run the administration at all times. And it's not even because we're not smart enough or educated enough to do that, because that wouldn't make sense either. Like, if we're not smart enough, how would we recognize who is smart enough, right? So really, it all comes down to the effort to organize and also participate in wide-scale voting. That's why we have representatives, because it's not convenient to vote on every bill, on every executive decision. But as technology evolves, difficult things become easier. Like, it wasn't convenient for people in colder regions of the globe to eat tropical fruits because, it, it was hard to transport. But now with this whole shipping infrastructure that we have now, it's much cheaper, and everyone can enjoy fruits from all around the world, not just the rich people. A few years ago, it wasn't convenient to stream entire movies over the internet because it would take a long time. I mean, you understand what I'm saying. As technology evolves, we need to revisit certain things to see if they become doable or not. And we do that. I mean, we regularly check and update all aspects of our life, and we allow technology to fundamentally shift the way we live. But for some reason, even though this happens, well, when it comes to our administrative system, we have this hang up. Like, we're romanticizing the work of some old-time politicians, like the founding fathers of the United States, which, yes, they had a very good design for their time. And if you look at democracies all throughout history, from Greek, Roman, American, you can see that the intention behind the system of representatives, I mean, the design was meant to just ensure proper distribution of power. It wasn't made complicated just for the sake of complexity. So what if we could all participate directly in the decision-making process is what I'm trying to say. What if we could all vote on what gets done and what gets approved? All of us, without compromising on the time it takes to reach decisions, and with less cost. And when I say less cost, I don't mean like 20% less. I mean 1,000x less. We would just pay 0.1% of what it takes now to run the administration. And in terms of benefits, well, that's difficult to quantify, but it's mainly peace in our hearts and in our minds, and peace in the world, and faster technological progress. You may be wondering, I mean, it seems that whatever reforms that I'm proposing here are aimed towards Western democracies, and you might be asking, how does this fix the risk of nuclear war coming from totalitarian countries like North Korea or China? I'll try to make that obvious, but let me just point out something. It's true that under normal conditions, democracies stand a higher chance of reinventing themselves because they're much flexible. However, any country, regardless of its political history, has the opportunity to pivot to a new administrative paradigm in times of acute distress, right? But let's continue on with the design now. Some of the components will sound very familiar because, after all, we're keeping intact the spirit of democracy, and others will sound completely alien. Let's outline a few key features. 3 of them. First one, anyone can propose a law. Second, everyone falling under the jurisdiction of a proposal, whether that jurisdiction is geographical in nature or not, so everyone who is directly affected by a proposal, can vote to either approve it or reject it. And then the third one, which will sound very alien, laws are partially written in computer code, and if approved, that code gets automatically enforced. So let's look at these one by one. First point, anyone can propose a law. Well, right now I think we have that. I mean, you have to gather signatures unless you're a member of parliament or Congress. But Typically in democracies, there is an avenue by which almost any citizen can be the source of a new law, if they manage to get popular support. But the second point is, we need a bit more restructuring for that. So the second point is that anyone can vote. Obviously, we can have like people going to the polling stations and stamping the ballot and engage in all of those agrarian practices, because as we know, ain't nobody got time for that. And yet, even though we don't send handwritten letters anymore, the reason why paper ballots are still a thing is because they are theoretically at least secure. It's very inefficient and it's very expensive, but at least we can have independent observers at the polling stations, when the votes are counted, and people can trust that the process is correct. Because if we were to do it over the internet and we would have centralized servers counting the votes, there would be no end to claims of fraud or hacking, and it's very likely that a centralized digital voting system would be hacked or manipulated by the admins. So then, how about a decentralized voting system? This was actually the first type of distributed application. When Ethereum was first introduced a few years ago, they had the code for a voting app as example of what smart contracts can do. It was like their Hello World application, which you would find in the code edit, on the online code editor that they had called Remix. So while it's risky to trust a centralized server with such an important task like counting the votes, it's completely safe within the context of a logically secured consensus, such as the one that is maintaining the balances of crypto wallets. This was proven time and time again to be very secure. And using smart contracts, we can leverage the same security for more advanced logical operations like voting. Granted, voting, it's not going a lot beyond just keeping the basic ledger. We just have this one additional operation of counting the votes. But still, we can vote on the blockchain. So that's cool, right? But who is actually doing the voting? Crypto is famous for anonymity, and it's a safe haven for criminals, has enabled a new age of prosperity for the black market because users are able to remain anonymous. So wouldn't that present a problem in terms of identifying the people who are actually voting? No, it would not. But anyway, why do we need to identify the voters? What's the point of that? So the way I see it, there are just a few reasons. One is to make sure that the person trying to vote is indeed eligible for that. So we want to prevent people from voting that don't have the right to vote. And also we want to prevent the people from voting multiple times. A rightful member of the voting population is identified through a set of features like citizenship, age, and in some cases the lack of a criminal record. All of these are now established by correlating the person's physical presence with their government-issued ID, so a document that they have, and information in centralized government databases. It's also centralized government databases that prevent people from double voting. So even though the actual ballots are on paper, there's a highly centralized digital component to the process, which is, if not a security liability, it's most definitely a liability in terms of trust. And we've seen that manifest lately. So the simplest way you can migrate the voting process onto a trustless substrate is by having these attributes that define eligibility as part of a logical entity in a smart contract. And voters can gain access or can be associated with this logical entity by registering to vote. I'm reluctant to say NFT, because I don't believe that's the right implementation for this, but something similar to an NFT that can attest your right to vote and can also be used to verify whether or not you already voted, but doesn't necessarily reveal your actual option in terms of who or what you voted for or against. And of course, this would very much simplify the logistics to the point that you can have as many elections as needed without driving up the costs. Also, the outcome of the vote would be instantly known. A not so great practice that would be made easier by the system is the buying and selling of votes. I mean, it's one thing to bribe someone to vote in a way that you want, and it's a whole different thing to just buy their ability to vote, like buy the actual private key. And of course, people would need to learn some discipline and basic hygiene around private keys, like how to store it, how to use it, and all of the things that crypto adopters now regard as common sense. So this would be a good intermediary stage where you have the whole voting on chain, but we still keep the one person, one vote paradigm, and we're able to vote as often as needed, which means we don't really need representatives. That being said, of course, just because you can vote on every single bill, on every single executive order, that doesn't mean you actually want to or have time to actually look into it. So this is where politicians come back into the picture, but this time as a thing that is nice to have rather than an absolute necessity. So you might exercise your right to vote directly, or you can delegate someone whom you trust. The nice thing is, if that person starts falling short of your expectations and they start voting in a way that isn't aligned with your values, you can instantly revoke your support for them. You don't have to wait for another 4 years to vote for someone else. So this is a whole different level of accountability for politicians, right? Now, like I said, this is a transitional architecture of an upgraded democracy. I don't believe this is the ultimate design that we should settle upon. It's something that we can relate to right now based on what we already know and what we're used to. It's not that big of a jump. It's familiar enough that people would not be afraid of it. Of course, many people would be afraid of it, and some for good reason. I mean, I don't want to say for good reason, but some people would be justified in their fear. For example, right now when you are voted into public office for a fixed period of time, there are certain arrangements that you can make, legal arrangements, that favor certain private interests at the expense of your constituents. That wouldn't be an option anymore. So you could expect a fair amount of pushback from the side of the establishment, which is corrupt, either illegally or legally, because laws have many loopholes. And you wouldn't have resistance just in the initial implementation phase, but it would be, it would be contested for a very long time by people who are not ready to just accept this new state of affairs. So that means we need to make sure that nothing can overpower our hyper-democratic mechanism. And you might think, how can anything overpower the will of the majority? Well, it's very simple. You can have a smaller group exert influence and power over a bigger group if they have weapons, or if they have better weapons. I mean, that's effectively what's happening in totalitarian states, where the population is oppressed through force. But think about it for a second. Would the police, the army, or whatever power structures the state uses to suppress the will of the people, would those work if they're not getting paid? I mean, nationalism can only get you so far. And if you can provide the material means for the soldiers to support themselves, then they're not likely to fight for you. right? And for that matter, if the government cannot pay for its institutions, it will not function. And this brings us to the most important aspect of this whole system. If we are voting on actual administrative decisions rather than for people to take those decisions for us, then we need to ensure that whatever decisions we make collectively get enforced. So nothing and nobody can be able to hijack the connection between the legislative and the executive. Our decision making process needs to have material weight behind it. And we give it that by relating the spending of our collective wealth to the democratic process. So the proposals that we would be voting would cost money, right? Also, the various departments in the administration would have ongoing running costs. And if we can directly control the flow of cash through the democratic consensus, so that means we can approve or cut the funding for anything, then there's no chance for anyone to take over our administration while the economy is generated by our own labor. And it so happens that currency is the main use case for trustless technology. Right now, and for the next, I don't want to say how many years, but long enough that it makes sense for us to do this, our economy is based on human labor. So to solidify the sovereignty of the people over their own work, the currency in which we transact all goods and services that we generate, that needs to have coded into it both the taxation mechanism and the consensus for approving expenditure. That way, nothing can dictate the spending except for our own democratic process. So I'm basically describing a DAO on the blockchain, right? At the level of the state. And this is not a new idea, I hope. I mean, most people that talk about DAOs are like, let's see how we can operate within the current framework and be compliant, which is fine. I mean, everything needs to be tested, but unless the DAO itself is the main administration, there's no actual progress being made in terms of lowering the risk of international war. Now, I'm ready to argue with anyone the merits of the system in the current context where we have humans powering the economy. However, as our tech capabilities evolve, we'll need to add a few more elements to this because we will automate most, if not all, of the jobs that deal with production and distribution of goods and services. So we need to talk about how we accomplish a peaceful transition of responsibilities, but also how we the revenue generated by these machines gets allocated, because they don't need to pay rent, they don't need to eat, but we still need to eat regardless of whether or not our skills are economically relevant. So in the next video I'm going to go into more details about this particular aspect. Another important point that would need to be integrated into any humanity management tool that we are designing now is the globalization of the workforce. So the current model of the nation state isn't really prepared for this because it's optimized to protect the staff within the geographical borders. But companies are hiring professionals all around the world, which means that the tax revenue collected by the state and consequently the very survival of the state depends to a greater extent on the well-being of the rest of the world. Countries are very slow to recognize this, and in fact, if they get triggered into acting out their strategic interests, then all economic considerations are set aside and they're just ready to duke it out. And when economic relations between countries were just purely trading, it was still dumb to wage war, but at least you can argue that, okay, maybe you can replace those economic relations, you can start trading the same things with other countries that you're not fighting with. However, when your tax revenue, when your very livelihood depends on the well-being of the people whom you're attacking, I mean, this is profoundly retarded, right? It's like that snake that attacks its own tail because it thinks it's a different snake. So we'll go into more details on how we can collectively acquire brains that are at least a little bit superior to what the dumbest of the dumb reptiles have. And the next video will also have a bit more, will be more technical, like we might even look at some actual code, or maybe pseudocode or logical diagrams. Anyway, we'll get more in depth in terms of architecture, but also implementation strategy. I owe you an explanation for why or how adopting this system in one specific part of the world would lower the risk of war at the global level. And what else? Democratizing the workplace and safe integration of AI. These two things go together very much. Actually, the whole system that I'm describing here is sort of a minimum viable product, and none of the features are optional if any of this is to work. So yeah, if you think this is interesting, maybe also catch the next video. And in the meantime, thank you for watching and take care.